Hey, Greg, let's do a quick sound check before you get started. If you're talking, we can't hear you.
Not actually talking yet.
Oh, okay. That helps then.
Yeah. I'm just waiting. I'm told to sit tight, so I'm just lurking on this channel at this point.
No. You're good. Just want to make sure you were good to go. For everyone, this is Greg Zeschuk. He is the co-founder and was the vice president for years and years of Bioware. For the discussion on the text itself is in the Power Up main stage discussion. Feel free to talk to him. Greg, I know that you wanted to give some words of wisdom and talk to the developers and those that want to know today. So we'll have you starting right about now.
Cool. And so I'm assuming you guys can hear me fine. So thanks, Jesse, for the intro. As you mentioned, Bioware actually started in my basement, and me and Ray started many years ago. Probably, let me think, that'd be about 22 years ago here in Edmonton. And I thought I'd sort of frame this conversation as a kind of a bit of a combination of Bioware history stuff, but also putting into context sort of development and where things are at these days. And so it's funny, again, I sit back here no longer specifically working in games. I'm still playing them, less so than before by far, but I thought I'd talk a bit about what, how we got to where we were and kind of some of the things about what we learned along the way, plus what sort of set the stage for gaming today. So, and then at the end, a bunch of questions. I think the idea is that we'll, I literally don't want to talk for too long. I'd rather also get some questions from folks. So that's the main thing. So as I said, Bioware started kind of early 90s in my basement. We transitioned from medical, working as doctors, from making medical software to making games. And so one of the things we did is, it was interesting because it was a very, very different time than today. One of the things that was probably most fundamentally different was that you didn't have the resources you have, such as this conference, such as all the things on the internet that tell you how to make games. There was barely an internet when we started, at least not much of a World Wide Web, but you could access, and not much information about how to make games. And so aside from actually having made them before, it was hard to figure out how to do that. So I think one of the interesting things that actually helped us and helped probably a lot of the early game makers was just the requirement for ingenuity, having to figure stuff out yourself. And that was just lots of books. Back in those days, books were actually really valuable. They'd often come with a compiler on a disk that you could kind of learn to program and that sort of thing. There was starting to be some articles online about gaming and making games on particularly PC. I mean, when we started, again, back early 90s, 93 was really when we got rolling. I think the PlayStation 2 had just only come out, or just came out as we were developing our first game, Shattered Steel. And that whole thing, it was basically like the Wild West. You had no idea what you were, very little idea what you were doing, what you're trying to go for. We had an idea what we wanted to make for a game, which I kind of look back now and kind of chuckle at, because Shattered Steel, our first game released in 1996, was a big robot sort of action game, which was funny because we sort of went after what was at that time what we thought was an exciting segment, but it was already really filled up with MechWarrior. And I think one of the things we learned is in a sense, don't go after the license, or don't go after try and beat a licensed game. In fact, our publisher Interplay thought it was a really great idea to release Shattered Steel at the same time as MechWarrior, or 1 week before, to steal their thunder, which didn't work. I mean, we actually were moderately successful. The game sold probably about 200,000 copies, which in those days was pretty good, and did pretty well. Reviews were pretty good. It was actually really cool. There was 16-player deathmatch on deformable terrain multiplayer, which was, again, if you think back to the early 90s, that's actually fairly advanced for the time. And it was a lot of technical excellence. Gameplay was okay. I wouldn't call it great. I did a bunch of the animation, so clearly the animation wasn't very good as a result. But it was a great first learning experience. It kind of merged nicely into the Baldur's Gate stuff. So one thing to call out that I'm going to kind of keep referring back to is scale. So in the world of gaming, scale has gone up just ridiculously huge, especially for when I'm talking about gaming. For my main reference points are big AAA console PC titles, the biggest of the big games that are made. Shattered Steel was one of those effectively at that time, and it was an average size one with a team that peaked probably no more than 15 people, and the game itself cost less than $500,000 to make. So just kind of keep that number in mind, and I'll kind of refer back to it. Next, of course, is Baldur's Gate, which obviously was a pretty big success and continues, funny enough and excitingly enough, to have a life thanks to folks like the team at Beamdog, some ex-Bioware folks that are continuing to keep it alive on other platforms and updating it. And that's actually really cool, is the fact that folks can come back and still play Baldur's Gate. I was just traveling, and I told this guy that I met, that he said, "Oh, I was a huge Baldur's Gate fan." I go, "You can play it again on your iPad now." So it was actually pretty cool to have that opportunity to sort of like see that game back alive again. And that was actually there's some really fun times on that one. That was actually a funny story about that one was that the original design for Baldur's Gate was actually actually kind of a fantasy RPG featuring mythology. So it wasn't a D&D game at all. It was a mythology-based game. So we're going to have different factions of mythology. And in some ways, I think we inadvertently were making an MMO, but we didn't know it. And it would have been interesting if we actually pursued that, because who knows where things would have went. But instead, we sort of pitched it, and Interplay initially had turned it down because they had a bunch of games they were working on. But then when they heard that folks were interested in it, they jumped all over it. They were pretty excited. And so we ended up signing with them. And then again, one of the learnings was, hey, things were tough when we didn't have a license, and we'd always wanted to work on a D&D game. So the chance to do that was a really nice opportunity to sort of to add the D&D world to our game, and see what that was like in terms of like working with a licensor. But I mean, I think it's fair to say like it was a really light licensor relationship, meaning we didn't have a lot of interaction for the folks from TSR. And it was funny because it went from being like TSR was the original guys to being part of Magic, or I should say being part of Wizards, which is of course the guys from Magic, and then Wizards that was then sold to Hasbro. So we actually, I think even just in the course, maybe that was by one or two down the line, but fairly quickly, we kind of moved through a bunch of different licensors with varying levels of what would I say, attention to the game. Because the early one, they couldn't really care less. Like with BG, they were like, well, whatever. It was pretty. It was not a huge. They didn't think much of it. It's interesting because what the folks in those days didn't realize was that how much pen and paper gaming was shrinking, or the folks at TSR, how much pen and paper was shrinking, and how big computer games were getting. And so by the time BG1 came out, it was, I don't know how many millions of copies it sold. Like, it's an interesting question because we don't know the numbers since like probably 10 years ago when we kind of stopped being involved with all the folks from Interplay, Atari, Infogram, all those guys, Wizards. Like, it's probably somewhere between 10 and 20 million. So it's quite a successful game, that both and BG2. So referring back to Shattered Steel, so BG1 was very successful, lots of sales, but size-wise, it was only a few increments bigger. I think probably 50, 60 people was the max, maybe. It was a long one, so it cost a few $1 million to make. But then you think, okay, so now that's 6 times bigger than Shattered Steel. So it was a 3-year, 4-year development. So that's explained partially by the duration of it. BG2 was a really, and I see the heart there in the chat, which is, I think we feel the same way. Actually, BG1 was a great game to make, but BG2 was a true delight to make because BG2, we literally just took the tools and technology and really everything from the original, just did a couple small improvements on graphic fidelity, resolution. As computing knowledge was, or computing power was moving along, we kind of matched that, but still kept it very, very similar. One of the interesting problems that one thing you learn from game development is if you can maintain your same platform, same kind of development environment, you're way more efficient. And so that was what BG2 was a really efficient development platform and process, because we had all the same tools and technology, and just kind of started really cranking final quality within the first couple months of development. So I think it was a pretty quick development. Again, more people, more money. You'd say, hey, let's say $5-7 million, 70, 80 people. So now we're getting into 12 times the size of Shatter Steel, and just a couple of years later. So that's a pretty fast growth rate. But again, very successful. Sold lots of copies. I think in the background, that again, really fun game to make, and really proud of that one. In the background, we were working on Shatter Steel 2, which turned into MDK2, and that was again a bit of a funny story in that working with Interplay. The guys over at Interplay were, we'd done Shatter Steel together, and it wasn't super successful, and we wanted to change it up. And then there's an opportunity. Shiny didn't want to do the sequel to MDK, and we thought, hey, this was really fun. And then we learned another kind of lesson, is we made a really weird game, because the original one was weird. It probably wasn't as successful as we originally led to believe, but they wanted to have a sequel, so we're like, okay, we'll make it. And it was a tremendously fun game to make. Because it was so weird and unusual. I'm not sure if any of you out there played it, but it was also really difficult. We made my favorite quote I saw about it was someone called the game hard. I think it was they're talking about Ninja Gaiden, which of course is hard. Then they said, but of course it's not MDK2 hard, which is both a good and a bad thing, suggesting that our game was awfully hard. Which we did a classic no difficulty level, like jump, miss, and die kind of game. But at the same time, the characters were super fun. It was our first console effort. It was on the Dreamcast, and another kind of development lesson there would have been. Probably not the best idea to make a really weird game before it was kind of established property, or you yourself were well established. So that's another kind of lesson. And MDK2 wasn't super expensive. It was probably, again, in the Baldur's Gate 2 range, so probably in the $5 million development budget range. So 10 times ish Shatter Steel, but again, just a few years later. And then things started getting really exciting, and we got up to Neverwinter Nights, and then shortly after that, Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic, and those were really cool. So having had some experience working in licensed games, I'll talk about Knights a little bit first. But Knights was fun because they were really interesting, because actually LucasArts folks talked to us first. They literally phoned us one day, said, hey, would you like to make an RPG in the Star Wars universe? And Ray and I were like, picked our jaws up off the floor, like, yeah, we would be quite interested. And it was really good timing, because we actually were planning on, quite literally planning on what our next project was going to be, and for the MDK2 team. And that, effectively turned into Star Wars: Knights of the Old Republic. And the very first demo we did, which was quite successful at E3, actually used the MDK2 engine to make a fake version of Star Wars Knights to show off. So that's another thing, is sleight of hand. Those of you that believe E3 demos, you have to be very skeptical, because there's a lot of sleight of hand that folks do at varying levels. And so that was kind of going on. So let's say that's off in development. Then we started doing Neverwinter Nights, and that was a more ambitious D&D project for us by far. And actually, it represented an interesting challenge for us in terms of balancing the objective of, hey, we really like story games, but we're also doing multiplayer. And I'd say that was a pretty fair tension right up to the end. I'm not sure if we ever got it quite right the way we wanted to, but at the same time, like Neverwinter's development tools, the ability to create your own worlds, even run servers, like that was one of the interesting things. We kind of left some technology in there that would allow you to actually save your character data in an online world. That was just really, really cool. And folks ran Neverwinter servers for years and had a very good relationship with the folks from Infogram, and they changed the name to Atari. So really good relationship with them. Less so with Wizards at that time because they had sold to Hasbro and all the brain trust of the really smart D&D oriented folks, and the Magic folks tended to have left. Like there was not many folks left at Wizards, and they were quite unhappy with us making this game just because we didn't want to do it our way, because we've made a few successful games in the past, and they hadn't made any computer games in the past at that time. So it was a lot of tension, culminating in us kind of not wanting to do any more D&D games, I'd say, at the end of it. So all the BG3 possibilities and all that stuff kind of went by the wayside, at least for us. And obviously other folks had looked at that, but we didn't want to deal with that anymore. Knights came out. So Neverwinter came out, again, pretty successful, even bigger. We're probably into the 100-person projects. Probably, the numbers start getting hazy, but let's say 20 times the cost of the 500,000, so 10 million-ish. It's 20 times the cost of Shattered Steel. So you're seeing a bit of a trend here, just getting bigger and bigger. And sales, up to that point, like both for Star Wars and for like Knights and Neverwinter, I think BG2 or BG1, probably BG1, funny enough, was probably still a bigger seller. Certainly the two BG2 games together, all very successful, but those ones particularly so. So you start seeing one of the points I was trying to make in this talk is that one of the interesting challenges we have in gaming today is that the budgets have gone up, and we haven't started. This isn't even the modern era I'm talking about here. Like gone up 20 times. That's not yet the modern era of gaming. When you start talking console, and that's I think one of the lures and the exciting things about some of the smaller games, more of the indie games folks are making. They're a lot more like even smaller than Shattered Steel development, but they can be really great games that are really, really fun to play. So after Star Wars Knights, we actually worked with Lucas to help place that with Obsidian. And it's funny because people kind of wonder why on earth we would do that. And one of the reasons was we were starting to get to a point where we felt we wanted to work on our own licenses and technology. That was one thing. And then second, it was a pretty tight development schedule, and we were concerned about having the ability to deliver at the quality we wanted. We at Bioware were always, while we took a long time at times, and the whole point was to get it right, to make a great game, to do something the fans would enjoy. Not always appreciated, not always understood. It's kind of a funny one because at the end of the day, we always did our best, but you never know how things turned out. But always very happy with what we ended up with, even though there's lots of little things we felt we could tweak and improve. Then the next, so after sort of Neverwinter and Knights, we started getting into the newer stuff, and I think that's where Jade jumps in. Jade Empire was our first attempt, and Dragon Age had started, but it was still very, we were starting Dragon Age, and it was still very, what would I call it? Not uncertain, but we're still figuring it out. There's a lot of figuring out to be done. So we started working on Jade Empire and had a pretty good vision for the world and what we wanted to create. Again, that was first game with Microsoft, and we worked with them for quite a while, obviously. But with Jade, it was quite a fun development cycle as well, because it was an area exciting. Like both me and Ray really liked the classic kung fu movies and Chinese mythology, and thought it'd be really fun to make something around that. And Jade Empire was really that, the culmination of those sort of figuring out how to make our own games and not own license in the world. And we actually did a huge, if you hear the stories of Jade, there's actually somewhere floating around still probably this gigantic book of the world of Jade Empire that we'd made, like just literally a source book that you would see for a typical role-playing game, pen and paper. We actually did one for Jade just to kind of like establish the history, the culture, everything else. And so Jade was tricky because I think we actually realized that we hadn't had much actual expertise in real-time combat, and that was actually probably, I think, maybe the one things, if we had a little more time, we could have tweaked and further improved, was balancing the idea of real-time combat and RPG systems. But from a pure artistic, pure story sense, I think, again, happy with how that one turned out. And it's interesting. It was a bit of a take it or leave it game where some folks weren't as excited about it, but some folks just absolutely loved it, and we still to this very day get folks talking about it. I know for us, like we actually did start working on a sequel and decided not to proceed with it because it just didn't. I mean, it was moderately successful, but another sort of development lesson was timing. Timing is everything in a way, and that one launched. I'm not sure if you guys remember, it's a while back, and some of you are probably youngins. But the Xbox was turning into the 360, and I think we launched Jade in March, and the announcement for the 360 was made in April. And quite literally, the game sales fell off a cliff for the original Xbox games. They just none. Unlike what happened this generation, where there was a lot of crossover between the generations, and it took a year or year and a half before folks weren't making sort of dual platform games. Like that was just a sharp, okay, we're not making any more, Xbox games, and it's going to be all 360s. So that was actually quite a painful, pretty painful kind of transition, because at the end of the day, we would have loved to have more time. And in retrospect, I always think of it, geez, it would have been awesome to have actually made that like a 360 launch title. Get everything right, tweak it, polish it, bring it up to a higher level of visual quality, and it would have been a pretty killer 360 launch. But live and learn. That one was, and then sort of one of those games we think about. Next one, and things could have been different, but you can never really go back to it. Next, and then about that time, like I think I said, Dragon Age I referred to. It's interesting because Dragon Age was cranking away. Quite a while, and I think we actually did our first full demo in the Neverwinter Nights engine, and it was pretty slick. Like we actually had a pretty nice looking game, but realized you need to really redo the entire thing, entire technology platform to bring it up to speed, or else we wouldn't be able to do it. Get to the level of fidelity we wanted, and that's always a tough one. Like I think if you think of most companies, like now is actually it's a little bit different, where you've got a technology providers in the sense of, within EA, there's the Frostbite engine, and then there's Unreal and a few, and Unity. There's places where you can get an engine now, and that covers most of at least your rendering and some of your game development tools. But game development tools also extend to more elements, such as things like the actual way you control gameplay. That, like for us, it was the whole conversation systems, as an example, were a very big and complex piece of our games. It was funny because I remember, when I think it was right near, as I was still there, we were starting to use Frostbite for some of the future Bioware games, and they were like, there you go, like, for example, Inquisition, and here Frostbite, it can do everything. And we're like, well, actually, there's no conversation system or cutscene manager or RPG system or robust UI for complicated UI. So we actually, what you learn from engines is they're really just a starting point, and there's a lot one has to build on top of them. So that was interesting learning experience. So Dragon Age Origins was funny. So within EA, so let's jump back into the world of how big was it, how much did it cost, kind of thing. So Dragon Age Origins within EA was a bit of a dark horse. EA had bought us by that time, and they really, since Ultima, hadn't published an RPG. And I don't think I can't remember if it was Pagan was the last one, or 8, or I off the top of my head, I'm not smart enough to remember which is which. But they really hadn't. They didn't have that much faith in RPGs. I mean, EA at the time was very much they hated sports games and some action games, some shooters. And that was really their strength, their familiarity. So publishing, and even though we're a part of EA, we had to really work hard to sort of educate folks and sort of teach them of what Dragon Age, how big Origin could be. And it's funny because at the end of the day, they're kind of, everyone's still skeptical because it's just something not familiar with. And then you're getting into sort of huge marketing budgets of $10-15 million of marketing, which are really substantial. And then the Dragon Age was a big project. It was long, it was expensive, and it was a high risk. And then the funniest thing about it was EA just, I wouldn't say totally threw it over the fence. I mean, they marketed it pretty well, but they didn't put their whole effort behind it as a company. It was not like someone there, like a Battlefield or FIFA or anything like that. Just kind of pushed it out, threw some marketing out, and then kind of sat back and watched. And very fortunately, it was a really well received, nice throwback to kind of a hybrid of our past RPGs, both with a sort of top-down element but an over-the-shoulder element that just people really, really dug. And again, very successful in the end, sold lots of copies. Again, then I'm referring back to, okay, how many Shattered Steels was that? Well, I would say, you probably couldn't even have a month of development for the entire amount of Shattered Steel, and we're well over 100 people working on it. Was it 50? 100? Was it 50 Shattered Steels? Was it 60 Shattered Steels? Many, many times bigger. Much, much, much bigger game, and much more expensive. And at the end of the day, one really interesting thing to think about is game prices haven't changed. And so, the cost of making games at this point maybe 50 times more than when we started. Price is exactly the same, and you're not selling 50 times more. So this really, I know folks were always unhappy, have probably become more unhappy over time about like day one DLC and things like that. But the simple reality is those things are required to have you make enough money. Like DLC is nice to make because you can actually make it for inexpensive amounts and launch it with the game and get a lot of kind of profit out of it. But that profit is making up for losses elsewhere. So at the end of the day, this is one of the big things I learned about the games business is that it's continually being squeezed harder and harder. Price has never changed. So you're making games for 50 times the original cost. Price is the same. You're not selling 50 times more. It squeezes everyone. And there are very, very successful games that have made enormous amounts of money, for sure. But if you want a big variety of AAA stuff, you have to kind of be willing to invest in those titles as a consumer. The other side of that coin is as game makers, we need to be willing to, it's got to be worth your while. Like we can't be, the great lesson for us is it's not something that, we have to make it worth your while as a player. It can't be something we take you guys for granted or anything like that. So that kind of brings us into a semi-modern era. Like I think next, I'm trying to remember now. So next up was probably, actually Mass Effect was first, funny enough, I think, before Dragon Age, because Mass Effect was still Microsoft. So I'll jump back in time. And so Mass was obviously our attempt to do our Star Wars, however you want to phrase it or characterize it. We wanted to make a space opera. We wanted to create our own world. We want to not have the restrictions of working with licensors. And I mean, we always, at Bioware, we'd always worked with licensed properties. Like, there were D&D properties, there were Star Wars properties. I mean, really, some of the best of the best one could ever work with, and you could never really ask for any better. But at the same time, there's a lot of restrictions. You have a lot of additional. I mean, you get a lot of great benefits, but there's a lot of additional friction. And so that it got to the point where Mass Effect was something we said, okay, forget it. We're going to be making our own world. Like, that's just the reality. We can't. We don't want to do it anymore. And so the Star Wars Knights team, which was again a lot of folks from Neverwinter as well, actually then went on to make Mass Effect. And that was interesting because it was about a year of ideation. Again, similar to Jade, we learned just that pre-production was super important to kind of both figure out the technology platform, which in that case was Unreal, and then also really figure out what you're making. Like, what is the game? What is the world? Again, for our type of game, we needed to have all the pieces kind of fit together in a cohesive package, and you couldn't just throw out a game with no backstory. Like everything had to be there. So good year of pre-production and a couple of years of development. And again, it was interesting working with Microsoft again. Like that was the second game we worked with them. We kind of had figured out how to work with them. Because they actually provide quite a few resources to developers when they're making the game. In other words, they have bunch of technology people and others that'll help you out. So we kind of took a good opportunity to use those things and then get usability labs, which we also developed ourselves. And it's quite funny. One of the funnier moments I remember in the original Mass Effect was about a few months out from the game's completion, we weren't happy with how combat was working, and we sort of told Microsoft, "Oh, we're going to totally change how combat works. We're redesigning it." And of course, they're like, "But you're shipping it in 3 months." We're like, "Yeah, but it's got to get fixed." So they kind of moderately flipped out at that point. We're like, "Well, we're going to do it. Trust us. We'll get it. We'll keep the old stuff, but the new stuff will be good." And so that was actually the funny thing that we did was just kind of literally redid the entire combat system and made it much better, more responsive, better action. We kind of, in a sense, had learned some lessons from Jade and applied them there. And it was interesting because, as much as concerned as Microsoft was, they kind of knew it was the right thing to do based on their own results. So it's kind of funny that in the end we were proven right and it worked out. So and then I think it was after that time that Mass transitioned to EA. Again, more directly under our control, so we had a little more independence. And Mass 2 was a much smoother development. The Unreal Engine was more fully baked. We were able to tweak a lot of the technology and really apply some of the fixes and updates they'd made, and really just worked on making the game better in our minds. And I think it's interesting because I know folks had there was a little less RPG, I think, in some people's perspectives, but at the same time, it was still a really solid game overall, really great experience. So I think that was actually always the challenge for us, was sort of trying to balance how detailed is it and how approachable is it? That's always a difficult thing. Dragon Age 2 is interesting because it kind of grew beyond its bounds. Like, it wasn't intended to be necessarily even a full release. We were thinking about it, and then we kind of pushed it, made it work. But then, in the end of the day, with Dragon Age, it was interesting because Dragon Age 2, like we did a totally different narrative structure, and that was actually one of the things I think people we I would say we're a funny we're a funny company in that sometimes we like to experiment and do things differently. And so in this case, the different thing we did was with DA2 was change into this chapter-based format and had effectively a set lead character and a little less RPG systems, a little more streamlined. And so I think that actually, again, some folks liked it, some folks didn't like it. But at the end of the day, it was a good lesson for us because it sort of set the stage for Inquisition. And Dragon Age Inquisition is funny for me for sure, because I was largely gone working on Star Wars: The Old Republic during the initial stages, and then as a consumer, when I finally played it, when it was out, I was super happy because I didn't know the story. So that was like the best thing ever, is like being able to enjoy effectively what's designed as a BioWare game. I was done at the company by then, but I still had a real affinity for it, obviously. But play a BioWare game and not know the story was the first time was a wonderful experience. And as I mentioned just now, my main attentions around the time of end of Mass 2 had actually shifted to Star Wars: The Old Republic, the MMO in Austin. I'd actually joined the team leading the studio down there in Austin. That would be 2009-ish. And just such a huge project. I think at the end of the day, what happened was it was moving along. We just couldn't. We knew MMOs were big, but boy, was it big! Like, it was just an immense, gigantic project. And so for us to sort of feel like we could deliver it, one of us, or either Ray or I, had to go down there and get hands on with it. And so that was me largely. And Ray actually did end up doing a lot of work running the overall Bioware studio. So that was it was kind of like the overall time when Bioware was growing a lot, lots of other studios, and I moved more into the Star Wars stuff, and that was just a huge, immense project. I have tremendous respect for anyone that makes an MMO or a Pokemon Go, because there's elements, but anything online, anything real time, anything 24/7, with servers, with security, with everything else, it's just an incredible undertaking. And Austin, and again, if we all go back, like, we start doing our how many Shattered Steels. Like, I'm not going to tell you how much Star Wars cost, but it was many, many, many Shattered Steels. Many more than even the other games we're talking about, which we're probably getting into the, I don't know how many times. I mean, like, I would say, honestly, when you're looking at a AAA game from a major publisher these days, you're probably, especially with marketing, in $100 million range. So if you look at the $500,000 Shattered Steel for an entire game versus $100 million, that's 200 times. So sales haven't gone up that much. Marketing has gone up. Price has not gone up. The overall cost of making and delivering a game is astronomically higher than it's ever been. That's, in the mainstream games, you're seeing less creativity or less risk taking, and it's a tougher gig. It's a much tougher business than it was. So Star Wars, yeah, it was interesting because we actually launched there were many people. We were definitely over the multi-million users at the beginning, and it was actually surprisingly stable. We'd really engineered for stability, and it's funny, like most MMOs these days, we knew that we were going to have to transition into free to play plus some sort of ongoing payment programs, and it's actually gone really well for the game. Like, I've left, I don't have the numbers, but I know everyone's really happy with how it's done. The last few years, you see listed, it's actually one of the higher grossing MMO games out there, which is pretty exciting. Mass 3 came out. I'm not going to talk too much about that. I'm sure they'll ask me lots of questions, but I think it's interesting because, like, that's one of the more common questions we get. I was a little less, definitely on the day-to-day, I wasn't as involved in it. 1 second, I'm logging back in again in case it's logging me out. There we go. If I was gone, I just had to log back into my computer because I wasn't touching it for a while. So Mass 3, lots of incredible technology and gameplay. I know folks not as happy as they would be with the ending, and I get that. And, I think it's an interesting learning experience. But I think one thing, people, believe it or not, we're always trying to do the best for the fans, and that's just the reality there. And then I was out, and then, Star Wars done. I transitioned out and got into the exciting world of beer. So nowadays, I'm building a brewery up here in Edmonton. Very different than gaming, but a lot of the project management experience is very, very similar. But it's like when you're talking about location of pipes and valves versus like bugs and code. So that's kind of very long, rambly, almost 40 minutes of just talking. So I'm actually happy to answer any questions, or I'm not sure there's any wisdom in there. I mean, games have gotten bigger, budgets have gotten bigger. It's harder to make a buck as a developer, and so developers do more aggressive things, but still need to be fair and balanced to the player. So that's what I got. So if you got any questions, I'm not sure how this works. I think maybe Jesse Chime Collins will sort it out for you. Yeah, that's really, I didn't, like I said, this is very kind of off the cuff, but I thought maybe interesting to talk about the history of what we did and why we did things, and then in addition to that, some of the ideas around like what's changed about games. So there you have it.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure.
Does anyone have any questions? I'm sure there's a lot of people here that have questions for you that would love to have have the answers about Bioware and its history. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I see there's Scalatavito is typing, so I'm expecting something exciting there. Yeah, if you type questions, I'll magically answer them. if I can. I can't answer everything, but I should be able to answer some things. I'm sure, hopefully something.
All right. So he said that. How did switching to Frostbite for Inquisition and Andromeda help you?
So it's interesting. Since I'm not at the company anymore, I can speak frankly. At first, it didn't. And I mean that. I don't mean that in a negative way. It's kind of like it didn't in that. It's a good question. It's funny because I think like this is a great example. Like when I remember when we were first looking at it, and they were starting to work on it. It's a lot of the stuff wasn't there, and it just because it doesn't, most engines are very purpose made for what they do. So if you really think about what the Frostbite engine largely had done up to that point, and in some ways, just think about it, like Bioware was one of like DICE's first customers, and it really has changed a lot. So I'm talking about kind of ancient history here, probably 5 years ago. But Frostbite was a shooter engine, which typically had very static sort of structures of gameplay and structures of data that didn't have as much interactivity as an RPG does, right? It's a great shooting, and visually is like it just is incredible. Like, so on the one hand, the one thing that Frostbite did without a doubt was just really improved the visual fidelity, the rendering quality, the material systems, everything was just incredibly better. But on top of that, the dark side of that was we had to rebuild all of the BioWare bits. So all of the conversation systems, inventory systems. When you think about an RPG, you don't really, when you're playing, you don't think about it. But then you think about like, okay, how many pieces of data are floating around? How many, like a save game? So it's really funny. Like if you look at Frostbite, it's primarily, let's say it's a multiplayer shooter engine in some ways, or a linear pathway sort of single player shooter campaign. There's no data to save. You save a save point and like a list of guns, and that's it. And you just move forward, and it resets everything. RPG has to save status of everything, of characters, of story bits. So we had to build, the entire database of like that actually stores the save games. So visual fidelity, incredible. Had to do a lot, but where it really pays off. So now we step forward and go. Initially, it didn't help us in a way, but then now it's going to help us immeasurably because we'll have absolute, incredible, state-of-the-art, best-in-class engine technology, visual fidelity, all the rest, which actually has all the BioWare stuff built in. And even better, you're actually seeing most other EA games using Frostbite, so they'll have added their bits. And so if we want to borrow the driving engine from Battlefront, you could potentially do that, put driving in. Andromeda may have more driving because suddenly, guess what? You got a whole driving system built into the engine. So where it becomes really powerful is over time as you start finding other pieces in the engine that you can use. So pretty tough initially, like chewing on rocks, as I would always say, but then later on, really, really great payoff for the power. So I hope that answers it. Any other questions?
I actually have a question for you. Actually, I have a couple. It's
Sure.
always fun talking to you, just first of all. First question I'm going to ask is, what would be your favorite game that you ever worked on? Out of everything, the history of BioWare, what was your absolute favorite?
That's actually, I get that a lot, and I have sort of a set answer, which I'll sort of answer. So there's two. I would give two. And so it's funny, like the one that was actually kind of both the most fun, the most crazy, the most self-destructive and difficult was actually MDK2 because we just winged it, like, and it was just crazy lunacy, self-destructive in that we were working way too long and kind of that was just the hours weren't great and all the rest of it. But we were pretty young men and realized, okay, we have to smarten up. It was a great learning experience. It was so much fun to work. It was just crazy fun experience. Never have anything like that in my life again. But from an output perspective, I would say, artistry wise, I mean, it's easy to say Dragon Age or Mass Effect, but I actually say Jade Empire, because I just really, really, really like the story the characters, the overarching kind of world, like everything about the game for me, from a story perspective, was just really special. And then it was implemented really, really well. Like the cutscenes are incredible, and just the whole gravity of what your impact on the world and the game itself was unique. And so for me, like that was just a really powerful experience, and I just really, for me, that was still. I mean, I love all the kids, the children, the games, but that one's probably the most fun, most proud of in a way. All right, another Scala Torito.
He says, how can voice acting help affect the immersion of a game? Is it better to have a text scroll or full voice acting?
That's another
Very
excellent
good question.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's funny because we actually would test it. So we would, before we kind of jumped at like a solution for any of our games. Like, it's funny, like in the Baldur's Gate days, like it just, you had, if you may recall, there was the first line of dialogue was spoken, and there really wasn't anything else after that. And really, being able to speak in your character's voice was powerful, but the whole kind of immersion element by having everyone talk it just draws you in more. So we literally would test different sort of outputs of like, hey, here's a one where we just write the text. Here's one where we say the text. Here's one where you don't say anything. And it was really interesting because, just for everyone's immersion, um, immersion, was just completely different. Like it helped it by, you drew you in. Like I think, but at the same time, it does immersively break it in some ways. Where what if they don't say the right thing? What if they don't sound the right way? Like we always felt when we always went to full voice acting, but there was always a dark side to it. So that was an interesting element. So I'm not sure if that totally answers it. We tested it. We liked it more. I think because you felt more engaged in it. So I'll go to Matt G Photo.
He says, how hard was it to include player feedback when creating a game, if the opportunity was ever provided? That's a really good question too.
Yeah, very tricky in a standard release type game where you're not like doing version releases or betas. We typically, I mean, with online stuff, I mean, with Star Wars, as much as we could. Like, I think the Old Republic was, again, for online games, for those kind of games that have more of a life online and more of that loot, definitely. Like, I think it's actually usually hard because often players will still have a really great piece of advice, or something you would want to integrate, but sometimes you just don't have the ability to like, just didn't have the ability to make the changes they wanted. And that was always tough. You wanted to make them, and when we could, and sometimes they would even be put onto like the back burner for a later date. So actually, what I would ask for Sky is, when you say how do you manage your projects, did you mean like what platform systems tools, or did you mean like what process, like agile or other types of development? That'd be helpful to have just a little more information about what you're thinking. So I'll do yours, both really. So it's interesting, like that changed over time. So project management, especially when you got into really massive games, got bigger and bigger. Structure, and part of the management of the project is how you structure it. And so we would typically have like a production thread, like a production line and the development director line. And so producers would sort of determine what was being made and like the specs of it and how it would act. And development directors would typically spec out the size and actually figure out how it would get implemented. So and hey, first it was Microsoft Project and all kinds of stuff. Later, we actually started breaking it down we started using agile developments quite a bit, probably throughout Bioware. I couldn't tell if they use it more anymore or not, but probably 10 years ago we started using it. And what was interesting about that was it actually broke the game down into smaller, manageable chunks. And so it actually, in some ways, was really funny because it almost turned the game back into what we originally were doing, was small teams working on specific goals. And how we manage it, it's like paying attention to everything, having a clear vision of what you're creating, having a roadmap of how you get there, and then having people take ownership of those elements. And that's just really the way to do it. I don't know there's any real magic. I think Handsoft was one of the platforms, and again, like it's funny for me because I wouldn't say I was more on the production side, but I did a bit of both. But at the end of the day, like it's really how much attention you pay to it versus tool or technology is not going to do it for you. It's like how much you really focus on what you're making and how you're making it. I
Cool
think
Boy Kane actually has
yeah,
a good question. The
yeah.
game was big, as in AAA. How long does it take to complete it?
So typically, our games would be minimum 3-year development cycle on a AAA for a brand new sort of platform technology. Sort of, if everything was like kind of starting from zero, it's big, big, big. Um, and it's funny because I think 3 years minimum. If you're starting with kind of like a stuff, your platform's done and we've done it a couple times this way. You're not changing a lot of tools or technology. You can probably do it too. It's really hard to make some like a big giant magnum opus because I think the way we made games was very content heavy and it was very labor intensive. Like something where it's all like Minecraft is a great example. Minecraft, there's the system, but there's nothing else, and so you don't have to make a ton of content if you're making like if you changed the system and added 4 new rock textures and 4 new types of rock. Once that was done, you just let it go and didn't have to worry about it. And it's kind of like that's just the difference in those type of games. Like we made very content heavy games. And that was actually again you kind of chuckle at that because it's both good and bad. But I like what we made, but it was also was one of the sort of trying to do one of the harder things you could do. Um, so that'd be I'd say minimum 3, and some are even longer, like 4. I mean, SWTOR, the Old Republic's probably been 4.5. Just a huge, 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 huge. MMOs are gigantic. They're super big, super long, tons of technology stuff you need to do. So I think there's.
I actually have a question, real quick.
Oh, okay.
This one's actually one that I'm curious on. It's David Gator. I'm a big fan of all of his work.
Yeah.
How is it working alongside him as a writer?
Oh, that's great. And you're probably aware. I think Dave left BioWare and joined the Beamdog guys, so that was kind of
Exactly.
interesting. Yeah, that was an interesting thing. It was the writers, and Dave is one of a number of very talented writers that we had at BioWare over the years, and it's really interesting. Like uh, they just had a different perspective on things. And so what was so great about the writers we had at BioWare and eventually all trained and we had a whole program on how you train people and how they learned it, was they could really envision the various threads of their story. A typical writer, they write from start to finish. It isn't necessarily linear. It could have time changes in the book or whatever, but there's no optionality. In other words, you can't say, oh, and if this guy dies, then you have to go to this chapter. They're not like choose your own adventure books, but our games are like a hybrid of choose your own adventure books and really high quality literature. So it's kind of like the challenge you have there is simply keeping it all in your head and being able to manage all of it. I think also the other thing they were really got really good at, and Dave again is one of the best at it, was characters with unique voice. Like really working out who the characters were and how they were different and how they felt different, how they were unique versus just so many games I see are just simple like stereotypes that are thrown at you, or oh, they just copied this guy from this movie or whatever. Like I always felt the stuff that we did was unique in its own, and that's one thing I think that people really appreciate. Like it's like it's really easy to like sort of like I always chuckle at you know episode 1, right? Like where all the characters are, many of the characters are stereotypes of the Gungans are like Jamaicans, and it's just ridiculous, right? Like it's just the cheap way to do things. It's a lot more work and seems a lot better to sort of create something with a new voice rather than just copying a voice and throwing it on there. So that's what I think the best thing the writers could do is not just the story arcs themselves and like creating, because once the characters are believable and authentic, the world will feel authentic. Um, so that's my thought there. I think Scala Tavito has another question there.
Actually, this one, his next question, it actually makes me think of Mass Effect 3 a little bit. How is it feasible for a non-multiplayer intended game to include multiplayer in it? Games that are story-based but maybe don't require the multiplayer but still have it. Like I said, makes me really think of Mass Effect 3.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the challenge there, in some ways, is simply um, the problem there. I almost call it a problem is that it's a market issue in some ways. Like it's the maybe lack of security that you're delivering enough. The opposite in some cases is true. I mean, like some games will deliver multiplayer. People will say, "Hey, where's your single player campaign?" This style of game is supposed like some shooters are that way, right? Um, so it's funny, like you think of a Bioware game in some ways you don't think of multiplayer unless it is a multiplayer game, like the Old Republic. So it's doable, but they end up being kind of bolt-ons. And I don't want to just like sort of diminish the effort of folks on it, but it's not necessarily part of the natural experience, right? Like, and it's interesting because I think in some ways if you can create a game that has like a seamless co-op experience. Like that in some ways is a better experience. Like if you can kind of jump in and like join the battle. Like if like let's say in Inquisition you could somehow take over one of the characters, the humans could take over the guys in the group and you all travel together. The problem ends up coming in, the collisions really happen when you are having conversations and talking to each other. Like that's the point at which it doesn't work very well. But gameplay wise it could work.
Awesome. We actually have some more people
So
typing.
like, there's an add-on there. Multiplayer does cost a lot of resources, right? Yeah, it's funny. In some ways, multiplayer is less pure labor intensive, but there's a lot. But you have to fine tune things better. So for example, multiplayer requires usually a higher level of like animation quality because people are, it's funny because when you don't realize it in a game, if you're playing a third-person game that is single player, you never see your character running or walking around. And sometimes there's a lot of cheats that the animators and the developers have done to make them look good, when in fact they don't look good. So it's actually really funny because, the moment you are sitting like staring at like player character type objects through scopes, sniping, and you see all these details, suddenly that is a lot harder to make. So I wouldn't say it's more resources, it's higher fidelity for multiplayer for sure. And then Gorlandelli has a long one.
G. Orlandelli. It says, how do you think that the recent growth in VR will impact RPG titles in the future? Would you be excited to work on such projects, or are we still a little far from having technology provide amazing RPG experiences?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. VR is a neat thing, except for I think it's unfortunately the word right now is neat. It's like I can't help shaking the feeling that it's really a demo right now. And the challenge for me as a player is like, do I want to play an RPG and stand for 10 hours, cranking away in a dungeon? like the idea of that is just like, oh, that sounds horrible. But the other side of that coin is, boy, is it immersive. Like it really, really is special. Like having played around a little bit, not a lot. I'm not by any means a VR expert at this point, but having played around with some of the demos and just seen some of the games, like it's so incredible. It's so well done. The feeling of being there. Um, for RPGs, it could be like an absolute godsend, right? But I mean, it's interesting when you think about like, hey, here's not, imagine if you could do a dungeon stepper, like remember the old school dungeon stepper games where, and maybe you don't have to even stand up, maybe you can sit in a chair and you have a way of kind of moving forward within the world, and you're not worrying about it's kind of like a regimented movement. But you can also look around, look at the walls. If you see a little brick that's like out of place, you can push it, you can interact with it, you can do stuff. If you see something down the hall or sneaking around a corner, you can do something. Like that experience for me sounds amazing, but it doesn't sound amazing if I have to sort of stand and wave my arms for 10 hours doing it. Like, it's not really a practical thing. So I think the trick with VR, in my mind, is there's still yet to be solved. Like, how do you have extended experiences? Yeah, that's right. It adds on, like, RPGs are lengthy. Like, even really a lot of gaming sessions, right? Like, if you're really having to wave your arms around and do stuff for a serious hour of, like, aggressive movement, like, that's it for your day. Like, you're going to be tired out. So I think VR is going to be the thing. It's a question for me about how they're going to get over that challenge of requiring sort of, so, like, when you think of, again, keyboard and mouse or buttons on a joystick allow you to spend a lot of time conserving energy and playing. They're also mentally stimulating, and that requires energy. So it's a very different. It's a different thing. Like, I'd love to see it. I mean, I can't wait for someone to crack that, because that would be just an incredible experience. But I have a feeling it'll be very different than what we're used to.
I actually have another question. Earlier today, we had Gregory speaking.
Yeah.
And a lot lately, your name has been tied to his. Do you want to give a little more insight on that?
Yeah, no, it's funny. I think we have a thing tomorrow about that, right? I mean, I'm chatting with him, if I remember correctly.
Yep, Greg Squared. Greg interviews Greg.
Yeah. So yeah, that was funny. So I've known Greg for many years. We were actually trying to establish where and how we first met, and I kind of think it was this game developer conference event in Seattle, like 20 or 15 years ago, some ancient times, and Greg was from Vancouver, but I think was down in the Seattle area working maybe with Humongous, if I remember correctly. I can't remember for sure, but anyway, and Greg was also sort of involved in sort of the genesis of the idea behind Homeworld, made out in Vancouver. But what happened is kind of funny. So we'd known each other, and from, as it happens, not dissimilar from my being present in your conference here, like the fact that I have trouble saying no sometimes, and so if someone pings me and says, "Hey, can you help me out with this thing?" And so I was, Greg actually wanted to talk to me about the next installment of Consortium, the Tower. So it's, they made the first game, and we chit chatted a bit, and then he was putting up Kickstarter, so I kind of put a little weight behind it, and sort of just said, "Hey, everyone, this is good guy, great vision," and it was interesting because it wasn't taken off quite the way I thought it would, and I don't think that was a function of the game or the presentation or anything as much as the challenge of Kickstarter, where it's clearly become more of a dice roll what's going to get delivered. Like, not everything that's getting kickstarted, you can be confident is going to finish. And, if there was a way to verify that something was more legit, more hearty thumbs up by some people in the know, that should help. And that's what was funny too, because I talked to the guys from Fig, the sort of financing games idea, where some of the financiers can actually participate financially in the returns. And it was interesting because I thought, that was a really helpful. That could have been. I thought for me that was a platform that was going to work well for what Greg was doing, because it would get them the money they needed, because like it was a game worth funding, and it cut through the noise. And I think the challenge of the noise and the Kickstarter space and everything else is huge. And I mean, I've done this before too for other friends. Like, there's a lot. Kickstarter is tough, and there's a lot of stuff that gets out there, and it's harder than it once was to get funded. So I think Scala Tavito has got another one brewing. He's brewing something up. He's our number one question asker.
Oh yeah, he's great. Oh, we got Gio.
He's on it. It's serious business.
Hey, you told me that this was going to be an hour and a half, so.
I'm good to whenever. It just seems I think we have a bit of a contest going on. But who's got the question?
Who can ask the question first?
Oh, I can hear a phone in the background.
Hello.
Oh, I'm still there. That's not me. That's That's some random fun. Actually, I can make it go quiet. Oh, let's go quiet. There we go.
All right, Skeletavito. He says, how do you explain success of games like Flappy Bird? Which are hard games and mostly frustrate us, but are still a success?
That's an interesting question. I certainly am not the one to be able to explain that, but I'm familiar with Flappy Bird, and it's interesting because there's also another element. There's another element to the Flappy Bird sort of thing, and it's different. It's like it's not even a Flappy Bird thing as much as it is like beyond just Flappy Bird. Like there's probably about 1 billion Flappy Birds out there. What caused Flappy Bird to be the one that was recognized? And I don't know about that one. That one's interesting. Perhaps it was his shenanigans as the maker. But I think there's a weird sort of like people are competitive. I think most people have some kind of competitive element to them. Some kind of like they don't like to lose. They don't like to be beaten. They want to demonstrate skill. Like I think there's the idea of flow, and I can never pronounce the guy's name, but this guy named Michael Krzyzewski, like it's a really super complicated name. I'll put a link into the
Besides all that, I immediately think of Dark Souls as well. It's the same concept.
Yeah, and so this like you'll see why I can't spell this. It's like, but flow is a concept that game developers talk about, which is here's a TED talk to him, and you can see his name Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. And so it's a flow thing, and so flow is a sense of mastery. It's a sense of being better. It's a sense of improving your skills or accomplishing something, and it's usually done in small increments. So Flappy Birds is something to be tackled, to be beaten. 90 I'm not sure, but say 50% of people play it once. This is stupid. Never play it again. Next 25 play it 10 times. This is stupid, and then the last 30% play it and play it and play it, play it, play it, and then they need to beat it. They need to beat their friend, and they also get into a flow state where they kind of get the feel for it. So it's almost like the perfect flow state game in a way. Like it's not quite dead on. He has a whole book about the subject, which is kind of a good, interesting book. But it's a factor in just that desire to improve. The people need stimulation. It's stimulating to try and tackle something challenging. I haven't seen this talk. I read his book. I imagine the talk is interesting, but it's a really neat concept that if you are interested in game development, it's a really good thing to be aware of. It's a common, there's a few different topics. Like this is one of the topics that as game designers, it's really good to be acquainted with. Another one.
I see it. G. Orlandelli says, while developing the Mass Effect series and many other RPGs, we can assume that you worked on the design documentation, GDD, Game Bible, etc. Can you tell us a bit more about how you manage all of that information?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big part of. It's funny too because some studios don't even worry about that stuff. Like if their game, for example, I don't expect Flappy Bird had a big one of any of those. No, not a big design doc. I think it'd be quite small. But like a game which is information heavy, a couple of really simple basic, you need that stuff. So a couple of really big simple principles, like you gotta have source control. So in other words, you have a way of managing versioning of game data. Like, we use source safe or whatever it was. Like I think, like you needed a system by which you would store the data, keep versions of it. You almost would actually literally have a map to the documentation. And the other thing you would typically do too is we actually got to the point where Bioware literally had professional editors. There was like a person, typically an editor on each project, that their job was to manage the documentation, design documentation, tech documentation. Their job would be to make sure it's up to date, make sure it's all stored correctly, make sure people know how to find it. So in other words, we'd have wikis. It's funny. We experimented with quite a bit with wikis, and some of the guys used them a lot, and it was pretty commonly done. But at the end of the day, like pretty standard classic documentation, Word docs or whatever sitting in source safe, pretty old school was one of the ways we did stuff. So not sure if that helps, but it's really just having the mind to organize things and then developing a system and then refining the system and having someone responsible. It's really, in a sense, as simple as that, and that makes it also quite scalable.
Looks like Skeletivito and Giolindelli are both typing again. They are in a constant war here. Oh, and Ske is typing as well. Who will ask first? Who will ask?
Yeah, questions are flowing. That's good though. In some ways, it's easier to answer questions because they're a little more specific than, as I mentioned, my random ramblings.
Oh no, absolutely. I was you're one of my special guests on here because I knew that you would just have so much flow of words of wisdom.
Well, there's a couple, at least two words of wisdom.
Here we go. G. Orlandelli says, "Awesome, thanks." And those documents are usually live, getting updated constantly, or were they usually locked down after a certain milestone? That's a good question.
They were typically live. Documentation is something that really need to be doing right to the end. Particularly if it's like commenting code or keeping people up to date on what you've done. So, documentation was where someone changed the stats on a sword, and then you go, why is this sword acting weird? Then you go back to the sword documentation and go, that's not a bug. It was made to do that. Okay. Here's the documentation that shows it. So it's a living doc, and it's funny. I would say in the case of an MMO, it probably lived beyond the release of the game. It would continue as the MMO or the live service-based game continues to evolve. So there, not locked down. Code lock is locked down for sure. That was definitely true.
We actually have Skeletivito with another question. What would you suggest me to go into the game industry if I was interested in working with game engines? You're working with assets, textures, and basically using the engine, but not good with programming, artists, and stuff in the business. Basically, he wants to know what would be the best way to make a game if you have a very specific skill set.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, the one on let me think about that one just a moment. I think if it's working creating stuff with the engine, so in other words, using creating levels or creating environments or scenarios, however you want to describe them. It's really just doing them. I think it's interesting. The getting into it is to really get into it nowadays. You have to have a basic set of work that's sort of you can demonstrate. And I mean, part of that is there are off the shelf games, and you can get texture libraries, etc., and you can make something. And that's actually, if anything, the number one thing I always tell people is do it. Do it, make examples, create things. One of the ways I remember one guys we hired at Bioware, we had Neverwinter Nights had a tool set. You can make levels with it, and there's a little bit of minimal coding that you could do with it. But the biggest thing is we want to see how people structure things and how they put it together. Many of Bioware's best designers were hired based on these sort of modules they'd made and how good they were and how much sort of unique stuff they had done. There was actually people that did things we could never figure out ourselves. So it's pretty interesting. The biggest thing is just don't think about it, just do it, and be thoughtful about what you do. I'm not saying don't think. I'm just saying if you sort of dream about something without attempting it, you never really get anywhere. You have to take the steps to undertake it, and that's the best game industry position. It is almost like a level designer. I think historically level designers didn't create necessarily the assets, nor did they. I mean that it varies a little bit though, and that may have evolved. But a lot of times they would have these assets to work with, and then they would create the environments based on them. So like level designers or using the tools to create is something that typically, and actually the real reality, at least in the AAA world, is is a lot of specialists on the big teams. Like you have people that just do character rigging, and then you have someone else that does animate, and then you have someone else that does facial animation. Like it's quite a interesting, very specific set of stuff.
We have CC Reagan asked a question. When you guys developed the KOTOR series, was there any specifics that you desperately wanted to do with gameplay or story wise that Lucasfilm didn't allow or didn't have time for?
Actually, not really. It was nice. It was interesting. So when we did the KOTOR series, we were specifically asked, when did you want to, like, we were given some options on when to place the game on the timeline. Like, so for example, it could have been placed between Empire and Jedi, right? Like, more up to date sort of timeline, or which is what we chose, the older timeline, the prior timeline. And we're exceptionally glad that's what we did, because it gave us a lot of flexibility. And it's really funny, like our conversation with Lucasfilm was kind of like LucasArts Lucasfilm was kind of like, okay, you can use all these locations that are used and stuff, etc., but just don't blow anything up that needs to be in the movies. We're like, okay, no problem. So it's actually really cool, and it's actually cool and a little sad in that they have since taken a lot of what we created out of the canon of Star Wars. But it's funny. Like I'm disappointed that's the case, but the other side, it's really funny. Like someone I know was really mad about that. I'm like, well, okay, so you're sad that our imaginary stuff's not part of the other imaginary world. Like it's not like it's like a scientific discovery or something. It's imaginary stuff. So it would have been nice, but at the end of the day, whatever. Like Disney will do what they want to do. The Lucasfilm guys were quite LucasArts Lucasfilm were quite flexible. CC Regan's typing. Dun, 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 dun.
No, to also go into that, what made you actually decide on the timeline that you actually chose? Because I know that the Knights of the Old Republic timeline is it had been basically partially touched with Tales of the Jedi and things like that back then. But what made you guys actually decide to go way far back like that?
And you're right. Well, we actually had looked at had the sort of comics and reviewed all that stuff, and I still have them stashed around somewhere, all the original Tales of the Jedi stuff, and it wasn't even those as much as it was the idea of doing prehistory. So by that time, we'd worked quite a bit on licenses and worked on D&D for a while, and we found the pressure points of where there'd be sort of frustration around, you couldn't use this, like D&D was interesting because by the time we were kind of leaving, like WotC and again, WotC was no longer really WotC. Or Wizards was no longer really Wizards. It was owned by Hasbro, and the Hasbro people are very much dunces, like super dunces, and they'd be, oh, you can't use like Drizzt, or you can't use like Elminster, you can't use, and we're like, wait a minute, we didn't realize we got a license that restricted the use of certain things. And they said, well, we just don't want you to use them because we're using them. It's like, well, that's not the deal. The deal is we can use anything. So we already, by that time, we were kind of seeing the limitations of licenses. And so if we're using a license, which we really did want to use, we thought the really nice balance point would have been to use it from a different time period. And the other one that's really interesting too is that actually what we learned, from seeing Star Wars Galaxies, at least initially, there was this belief that, because of the sanctity of that Jedi and Empire time frame, that you couldn't have a lot of Jedi then. Like, in other words, you couldn't have a game full of Jedi because that's just not what was there. Whereas in the olden days, there were tons of Jedi and Sith running around, and they'd pop out of space every once in a while and attack people. So it was a really cool opportunity. I think CC Regan, we got a whole bunch of questions.
Yeah, I know. Let's start with you, Regan. When you guys developed, hold on, we already did that. How did developing the lore of Mass Effect compare to having the base layer of Star Wars? Was it? Was it? Oh no. Okay, that's actually a separate
No,
question. That
that's
is
right.
actually two questions.
Well, no, and I think it's. I'm gonna answer the second part too. Was it more liberating or difficult? It was both. It was liberating and it was difficult. So creating our world was tricky. You know, it wasn't. It's not as hard. You just have to have imagination and figure it out. And you know, like obviously Star Wars is kind of made up as well, so it can be done. Um, and it was incredibly liberating in that you didn't have anyone saying yes or no. You can't use this or you can't go there. It's just we could do whatever we wanted, wherever we wanted, however we wanted. The challenge, of course, is like making sure people care, like making it big enough that people really are interested. Otherwise, it's kind of pointless. You can have a really wonderful, liberated world which no one's familiar with and no one plays. So that's the tricky part, but we pulled that off, which is cool. So I'd go with Gioran Deli next.
It says, when building an RPG, was it common for you to look at inspiration on other game genres or even outside of games? Mind mentioning a few of those influences?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, I would say without a doubt, like a lot of our inspiration. I mean, if we just like outside games, it'd be movies, right? Like, I mean, if you look at what we did from a conversation interactive perspective, it was really, you know, movie driven. I think we used the term filmic even at one point. Like, we want to make them more like movies, games more like, or games to feel like you're in the movie, being the actor and the director, like to be inside the movie was like, one of our objectives. It was really cool. Um, Other genres, yeah. I mean, you know, you're always looking at other genres, and I think when we, you know, when something like Mass or you know Jade both had action combat, you know, you got to be. It's a dangerous direction to go simply because um, you don't get a buy just because you're an RPG. So in other words, you can't have like sloppy action combat just because you say, oh, we're not really an action game. It's like you have to nail it on both counts. You have to nail the RPG side and you have to nail the action side. So it's actually a challenge. It's a challenging uh, objective, and so therefore you do tend to look pretty carefully at other games and genres to understand what the state of the art is, and that's just true of gaming in general. It's wise to know what's going on so you're not surprised.
Scaletta Vito has a question here. He says, does the industry consider people perfect at something or good at something? Considering their personal behavior with perfect guy, with not being much of a team guy. Basically, what makes the perfect teammate when it comes to a game?
Yeah,
With that.
the ideal person is someone who's skilled and diligent and good to work with. Like, if anything, over the years, I've shifted significantly toward um, team quality people. Sometimes you'll make some kind of, we're definitely flexible and trying to consider individuals, but there's a point where people aren't reasonable, and I think that's the point at which it's just not worth working with them. So it's kind of a direct but hard kind of position. But at the end of the day, you only have so much time to work on a game, and you'd rather do it with people that you like. The other thing is also true. You might like someone and they may not be very good, so they shouldn't be on the team either. Like, it's really, you want to have a combination of professionalism, quality of work output, and good teammate. That's you want to be all those things. You want to be diligent, disciplined, and do your work and do well. So, and the sort of whole idea of like the crazed genius who will save the game and stuff is just not true. It really isn't, especially when you get into games that have like 100, 200, 300 people working on them. A small number of people do create a huge impact. It can make a difference, but if they're also creating destruction in their wake, that will usually overshadow their positive contribution.
All right, awesome. It looks like we got CC. Telltale, Hitman, all these different games like that. Uh, do you believe that that's going to be the future of gaming? Is chapters?
It's interesting. We thought a lot about that because I mean, because we were story based, because we were uh, just don't worry, we're just answering now. Like we thought a lot about episodic games because I mean, it would have been great for what we built, and we were, and there have been some successes in that space, but it's tricky, right? Like it's almost like episodic game. If you look at like TV's also even gone the opposite way. Like I mean, the idea of binge watching shows on Netflix shows that people, in some ways, if they can, would have it all at once and don't like the delay. One challenge I think facing episodic games is as well is that there's always something new and shiny coming, and if you really stretch out the delivery of the episodes, folks are going to be like distracted and forget about you. So it could be done. Maybe it has been done a little bit, but I think it's a tough one because I don't think people necessarily, like people themselves don't necessarily want them episodically. If you look back to the consumer level, like, are they asking to have it in pieces or not really? I mean, they want the whole thing. So I think it's episodic gaming is more about like the convenience and the challenge of like breaking up content creation, unfortunately. So I don't think it's necessary. Yeah, it does give you time for development, but like one thing I learned is the consumers don't really care. Like they want it all. So that's the point. Is like it's not something the consumer wants, something you want, and maybe you can do it, but I think it's dangerous. It's definitely a dangerous thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Greg.